Hey guys, Nicholas Fordham here. They call me the Web Guru. I'm sitting here broadcasting once again something very creative and unique. Now, where we're sitting is in Palo Alto, right across from Stanford University and just down from one of the NASA Space and Science Centers. Sitting next to me is Miss Pamela Clark. Pamela is a brilliant scientist. One of the great things that she's done is create the very first X-ray and gamma ray that has been sent out into orbit and studied a little bit of space. And we're sitting here at an event that's called the LunarCubes event. This is the third international event. We're actually at a green screen room. You can see a little bit behind the scenes. We're sitting in front of a green screen, and that's what makes it look like we're in space. So the event that we're at, the LunarCubes event, it's all about a little cube about this size.
That's what started it all. Bob Twiggs, who's sort of the father of CubeSat, wanted his students to be able to have hands-on projects, make these little packages that could be launched in space for very little money. He actually started at Stanford, believe it or not. And he wanted to look for something small. So to come up with kind of a standard size, he thought about something about the size of a Beanie Baby box, which is pretty close to this. This is a 10 centimeter on a side cube. This is a 1U cube. And the standard for launching CubeSats in low Earth orbit now is somewhere between this size and 3U. So about that size. This is actually kind of a big. It's a little bit more than 10 centimeter on a side. It's actually sort of a bigger cube. And we're looking at taking that paradigm that was used for lunar low Earth orbit CubeSats. And that involved basically small standard platforms, standard components, standard interfaces, and using that for deep space exploration. So the idea is that you come up with a standard platform, and the first question is, can you use the same components, the same packaging that's already used for CubeSat? It's now a mature technology, though a disruptive one, that's been developing over the last 10 years. And the answer is, we can use a lot of the same things. They have to be made a little bit more radiation hard to survive space. But we probably can make something that has all the special things you need to do deep space. You need to deal with a much more rugged environment. You need to think about thermal protection, radiation protection. And if you're going to do science, you need to have a lot more active control of the spacecraft. So when you add all the things that you need, the things that are already being developed for science-driven experiments in low Earth orbit, you can probably come up with about a 6U. That's about 6 of these. It's still really small for a spacecraft. And typically for CubeSat, you're launching these little, essentially glorified instrument packages, although they have the same functionality as a regular spacecraft, except for the propulsion system, because they can be dropped off at a particular location by something that essentially gets them there, and then they can do all the things that a regular spacecraft can do when the spacecraft is where it needs to be. So they need to be able to keep pointing down toward the instrument pointing down toward the target. They need to be able to maintain the orbit that they're in. They need to be able to protect the instruments, maintain the temperature range that all the components can survive inside the spacecraft. The same things that a normal spacecraft can do. And we think that you can do this typically for about 6U. Maybe that's 1, possibly 2 instruments. And instead of just adding more instruments and coming up with what we call a Christmas tree, which is what most spacecraft are now, one of a kind, many instruments involved, we like the idea of flying a network of these small satellites, small CubeSats. And there are a lot of advantages to flying a lot of small things. You can look at changes as a function of space or time, which you can't do with a single spacecraft. You can put your instrument where it really needs to be to get the best possible data, and typically on single spacecraft with lots of instruments, they compete for being able to control what orbit they're in, how many resources they use. So if you fly a spacecraft with one instrument on it, can go exactly where the instrument needs to go. Get the kind of data the instrument needs to get. And if you make them a little bit smarter, so they have enough onboard autonomy to essentially fly themselves, you can do a kind of exploration that we only dream of now, where you can do real discovery, target of opportunity exploration. You can do virtual observatories made from a lot of little small pieces that can control the way they're configured. And you can do spatially and temporally distributed measurements of whole systems.
So right now, what's going on just outside of Earth's orbit is there's these little boxes about that size, a little bit smaller, called CubeSats. Now, these CubeSats are out gathering information and sending that information back to Earth. And so the idea with LunarCubes is taking that same concept,
Right.
creating a little bit bigger of a structure that can withstand those deep Kelvin temperatures, polar hot, polar cold,
Right.
and setting these LunarCubes up in a fashion where it's equipped with equipment, just like the cell phone now is basically a mini
Right.
personal computer, and taking the technology advancements, placing that inside of these cubes, and sending these cubes out into outer space. Now, once they're sent out into outer space, from what I understand, is since it's so small, the 1U all the way up to the 6U, now it's a lower payload. So it's reduced costs into sending it out
Yes.
into space, reduced costs in developing the product.
That's right.
And now once they get out into space, they can, in a sense, create a formation and start flying through space in that formation and picking up a much larger territory
Right.
of information.
Well, it's a combination of it's the smallness, it's the standardization. So you're using a standard platform with standard interfaces, standard components. And what's creative about it is that you take these standard components and you do the layout. You configure it in a way that works for you for that particular application. And the packaging is standardized so that what typically happens with CubeSats now is that they find space on something that's going into space already anyway, a primary spacecraft being launched that has extra mass and volume.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're very predictable in terms of what their size is, you can figure out how many you can fit. It's relatively easy to do what's called manifesting them, giving them a place in some of the extra leftover volume and mass. And NASA actually has something called the CubeSat Launch Initiative, which is designed to, people can apply to it to take their CubeSat and ask to find room on a payload that's on a primary spacecraft, on a launch vehicle essentially that's going to space. Now this is done for low Earth orbit. What we need to do is extend this beyond low Earth orbit for deep space. So things that are going into higher Earth orbit or Earth escape trajectories or to another target.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of different companies are looking at building these carriers for multiple CubeSats. So you could fly maybe 10, maybe 50 CubeSats to a target and take measurements simultaneously with either the same instrument or very different instruments and learn a lot more than you could with a single spacecraft. And it would cost you a lot less because in Earth, low Earth orbit, costs for sending something into orbit are reduced by at least 2 orders of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they're very attractive now to people who look at Earth applications or heliophysics, things that involve going into orbit around the Earth. But we can expect similar cost savings for deep space. The trick is, once you get economies of scale. So once you can get to the point where you have a standardized platform or components and you make many of them,
Mm-hmm.
and instead of flying these great big spacecraft like the Mars Science Laboratory that land in one place with a lot of things on it, require huge amounts of power and bandwidth, instead if you had a bunch of smaller things that could be distributed over the surface to take measurements at different places, you can learn, I would argue you can learn a lot more. There are very sophisticated instruments now that can give you in situ measurements, that can tell you, when you take them over a large area, that can tell you probably at least as much or more as collecting a sample. Collecting a sample, which seems to be the best thing to do. Actually, there are issues with it, like you get a contaminated sample. How do you pick your sample? How do you pick a sample that's representative? That's not easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot that we can do with the distributed measurements, and there are a lot of instruments that have been developed over the last 10 years that are very good at providing in situ measurements for very little mass, power, and bandwidth.
That's absolutely incredible. And here's the best part, is for those of you that are listening to this and are absolutely interested in LunarCubes and the LunarCubes initiative, not only can you watch what's going on, but for those of you that want to invest in the product and get out there, get your company name on the product and really start researching this more in depth. Let's just say it's Chevron and they wanted to place a gas station in the L1 position between Earth and the Moon, right? Or it's another company
station,
like Boeing.
A communication node.
Mm-hmm.
We're in need of essentially communication nodes made up of a lot of small assets like CubeSats that have the capability of communication that can essentially be at key locations like L1, L2, maybe in one of these stable lunar orbits, that can be there, easily replaced because they're all the same, essentially. And that can provide the kind of communication that you need to operate in this new environment. But much easier than trying to get enough ground stations to provide the kind of support that you need to download your data. So there's lots of opportunities for things that can be in these locations that can provide resources that are needed, including bandwidth communication, but potentially also refueling. That's actually been talked about as a concept for putting things in Earth orbit.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Clark, for your time. Absolutely brilliant. This is an amazing initiative that you're at the forefront of, and I can't wait to hear more information about it.
Thank you very much.
For those of you that are watching, either on YouTube or on the website, be sure to leave your comments below. Get to www.lunarworkshops.com. Get involved. Be a part of the community. Leave your feedback. And if you're a big business and you want to be a part of a big movement, definitely reach out to LunarWorkshops.com.